Man mocked God every day until one day the Lord taught him a surprising lesson. The sun was already high when Joseph unlocked the doors of his small restaurant in the city center. The clock on the wall showed a little after 8 in the morning, and as always he was the first to arrive. The modest but cozy place smelled of fresh coffee and bread just out of the oven. The walls, decorated with old photographs, told the story of a place that had once been more than just a business. It had been the shared dream of Joseph and Claire. Joseph was 50 years old, but the wrinkles on his face, marked by bitterness and pain, made him look older. His expression bore the severity of someone who, even after so many years, had not been able to overcome the loss of his wife. Claire, the love of his life, had passed away 5 years earlier, the victim of an aggressive cancer that consumed her quickly. Since then, Joseph had changed. The man who once believed in God and the goodness of the world was now a cynic, disbelieving in everything and everyone. He walked across the room, heading to the counter to organize the day's orders. His hands, though steady, carried the weight of a sadness that never left him. The bell on the door rang, announcing the arrival of the first employees. Among them was a new hire, Ashley, a 19-year-old girl who, despite the youth evident on her face, carried a surprising maturity. Ashley had been hired just a few days before, but her presence was already noticeable. Always with a smile on her face, she greeted everyone with contagious joy. It was hard not to notice the small cross-shaped necklace she always wore, a symbol of her unwavering faith. Ashley came from a deeply religious family, and her gratitude to God was evident in every word and action. She was the opposite of Joseph in every way. That morning, while setting the tables, Ashley struck up a conversation with Joseph. She spoke enthusiastically about her faith and how she believed that God guided her steps and blessed her daily. Joseph, however, reacted as he always did to any mention of God or religion, with sarcasm. "Do you still believe in that nonsense?" he asked, raising an eyebrow without taking his eyes off the counter where he was preparing the coffee. "Religion is just an excuse for people not to face reality. If God existed, do you think the world would be the way it is?" Ashley was not shaken. She was used to facing skeptics, and in a way, she understood the pain behind Joseph's words. But as always, she responded softly. "I believe that God has a plan for all of us, Mr. Joseph. And even when we don't understand why bad things happen, I know He is with us, guiding us." Joseph let out a short, bitter laugh. "A plan?" he repeated with disdain. "If He has a plan, it must be a terrible one, because in my experience He only enjoys seeing people suffer." Ashley paused for a moment, considering what to say. She knew that Joseph had lost his wife, but had never spoken to him directly about it. She realized the topic was a minefield, but at the same time, she felt the need to respond. "I'm sorry for your loss, Mr. Joseph," she said sincerely. "I can't imagine the pain you carry, but I know that God never abandons us, even in the darkest moments. Maybe He's trying to show you something, a new way of looking at life." Joseph finally looked up, staring at Ashley with an expression that mixed disbelief and irritation. "A new way of looking at life?" he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "The only thing He's shown me is that I'm alone in this world, and that believing in anything beyond what I can see and touch is a complete waste of time." Ashley didn't back down. Instead, she held her gaze full of compassion. "I believe you're not alone, Joseph, and I will continue praying for you, even if you don't believe." Joseph scoffed, turning his attention back to the counter, ending the conversation. But inside, Ashley's words echoed in a way he didn't want to admit. There was something about that young woman, about her unshakable faith, that disturbed him deeply. Perhaps it was because she represented everything he had lost: hope, belief in something greater, the idea that love and faith could overcome any pain. He didn't know how to deal with that. And while Ashley continued her work, always with a smile, Joseph found himself confronted by a growing doubt. Perhaps deep down, he still wanted to believe, but for now, bitterness and skepticism were still stronger. The day continued as usual, with customers coming and going, oblivious to the internal battle Joseph was fighting. To them, he was just the efficient and somewhat grumpy restaurant owner. To Ashley, however, he was a lost man, someone who needed to be saved, even if he didn't want to admit it. The restaurant was as busy as usual that Friday morning. The regular customers took their seats, and the sound of cutlery against plates mixed with the murmur of conversations. Joseph, as always, was behind the counter, watching everything with a critical eye. He was a man who liked order and efficiency, and he made sure that his establishment operated like a well-oiled machine. Ashley, with her usual energy and friendliness, served the tables with a smile on her face, exchanging friendly words with the customers who had already grown fond of the young woman. Her always cheerful and faith-filled presence contrasted sharply with Joseph's rigid and severe demeanor. However, no matter how much Ashley tried to lighten the atmosphere, Joseph remained unshaken, a fortress of skepticism and disbelief. Everything was going as usual until the phone rang on the counter. The sound, which at any other time would have been just part of the routine, that morning sounded ominous, like a harbinger of something bad. Joseph, distracted by a customer, answered without much thought, expecting it to be a supplier or a customer with a special order. "Joseph's Restaurant, good morning," he replied with his usual firm voice. On the other end of the line, a serious and controlled voice spoke. "Mr. Joseph, this is Dr. Caroline Martin from the Central Hospital. I'm calling on behalf of your son, James." Immediately, Joseph felt a tightness in his chest. The doctor continued, "He was in a serious accident downtown. He is in a coma and in critical condition. It's important that you come to the hospital as soon as possible." For a moment, Joseph's world stopped. He was silent, unable to process what he had just heard. The phone trembled in his hand, and the doctor's voice seemed distant, as if she were speaking from another reality. But at the same time, the news hit him like a brutal blow, awakening memories he had long tried to suppress. "Doctor—" Joseph's voice faltered, almost a whisper. What happened?" The doctor explained the details with the delicacy her profession demanded, but nothing she said could soften the impact. James had been hit by a car while crossing the street. The impact was so violent that he lost consciousness immediately and was taken to the hospital in critical condition. The chances of recovery were uncertain, and the possibility that he might not survive or never wake up was real. Joseph hung up the phone in silence, feeling the weight of despair falling on his shoulders. For a moment, he just stood there, staring into space as if his mind refused to accept the gravity of what he had just heard. The image of Claire, his wife, appeared in his mind like a ghost he couldn't push away. The day she passed away, the hospital, the final diagnosis, everything came back with painful clarity. Ashley, who had been watching Joseph from a distance, realized that something was terribly wrong. She approached slowly, with a concerned expression. "Mr. Joseph, is everything okay?" she asked softly. Joseph looked at her but didn't see the young woman in front of him. His eyes were distant, lost in a past he couldn't leave behind. After a few seconds, he responded with a broken voice. "My son, James, he was in an accident. He's in a coma. I don't know if he's going to survive." Ashley placed a hand on Joseph's shoulder, offering the only comfort she knew how to give, her presence and her faith. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Joseph. I'll pray for him, for you. I know that God is with you both." But Joseph, though deeply shaken, reacted with his usual hardness, brushing Ashley's hand away. "No, there's no need," he said, trying to maintain his composure. God isn't with anyone. He already took away the one I loved most, and now he might take my son too. There's nothing your prayers can do." With those words, he hurried out of the restaurant, leaving Ashley and the other employees in silence, unsure how to react. Deep down, Ashley understood Joseph's pain, but she also felt that he was wrong. She knew in her heart that God would not abandon Joseph, even if he didn't realize it now. Joseph arrived at the hospital in a trance. Every step he took, every corridor he crossed, brought him back to the worst moments of his life. When he finally reached the ICU where his son was, he was greeted by Dr. Caroline. She led him to James's bed, where the young man lay motionless, connected to machines that kept his body functioning. Joseph approached, feeling his heart tighten as he saw his son in that condition. James, who had always been so full of life, now seemed like a shadow of himself. The image devastated him in a way he didn't know was possible. He fell to his knees beside the bed, holding James's hand, feeling the coldness that contrasted with the warmth of a father's heart. "James, my son," he murmured, unable to hold back the tears. The doctor, observing from a distance, knew there wasn't much to be said. Science had its limits, and even with all the hospital's resources, there were no guarantees that James would survive. She left Joseph alone, respecting the moment of pain. Alone in the room, Joseph was overwhelmed by a whirlwind of emotions. Anger, fear, sadness, and guilt mixed, forming an internal storm. For the first time in years, he felt small, powerless, as if all the control he thought he had over his life was slipping through his fingers. At that moment, he remembered Ashley's words, echoing in his mind, "God is with you." But Joseph couldn't believe it. To him, God had become a distant entity, if he existed at all. How could he be with them if he allowed such terrible things to happen? However, as much as he wanted to continue believing he was right, that the world was a cruel and senseless place, the sight of his son in that state planted a seed of doubt in his heart. Could he be wrong? Could there somehow be something more, something he couldn't see? But Joseph pushed those thoughts away. He couldn't afford to delude himself. Reality was harsh, and he needed to face it, even if it meant losing another person he loved. Joseph stayed by his son's side for hours, lost in his thoughts, in his pain, until finally a nurse informed him that visiting hours were ending. Reluctantly, he stood up, releasing James's hand, feeling as if he were abandoning his son, even if only for a short period. The day had barely begun when Joseph returned to the restaurant. His steps were slow, dragging as if each one required a Herculean effort. The night spent at the hospital beside James had left him exhausted, but it wasn't just physical fatigue that consumed him. It was the emotional pain, a pain that rooted deeply in his heart. As soon as he entered the restaurant, the employees noticed something different. Joseph's expression, usually severe, was now tinged with a shadow of despair. He didn't greet anyone. He simply went straight to the counter, where he leaned, running his trembling hands through his graying hair. Ashley, always attentive, noticed the change in Joseph. She knew about James's accident and felt empathy for the pain he was going through. While preparing an order, she decided that when she had the opportunity, she would offer her prayers once again. She knew Joseph was suffering, and in her heart, she believed that faith could offer some comfort, even if he refused to see it. The restaurant's activity began to pick up, and Joseph tried to concentrate on the daily tasks, but his mind kept returning to the hospital, to his son's inert face, trapped between life and death. The fear of losing James, as he had already lost Claire, gnawed at him from within, fueling a rage he couldn't control. It was at that moment that Ashley approached. With the same gentle smile as always, she stood beside Joseph, hesitating for a moment before speaking. "Mr. Joseph, I know you're going through a very difficult time. I just wanted you to know that I'm praying for James, and for you too. I know that God is listening and that He has a plan for all of us." Upon hearing these words, something inside Joseph broke. The anger that had been growing since the news of the accident finally exploded. He turned to Ashley, his eyes, usually cold, now burning with fury. "Prayer? You still have the nerve to talk about prayer?" He almost shouted, causing the few customers present and the other employees to stop what they were doing and look in their direction. "My son is in a coma, fighting for his life, and you come to me with talk of God's plan? What kind of cruel plan is that, Ashley?" Ashley, even in the face of Joseph's outburst, remained calm. She understood that those words weren't directed at her, but rather at the pain Joseph was carrying. "Mr. Joseph, I understand your pain, but—" "Understand?" Joseph interrupted her, his voice dripping with sarcasm and hurt. "How could you understand? You don't know what it's like to lose someone. God? If that God exists, He only knows how to take things away from people. I lost Claire, and now I might lose my son. I don't want to hear another word about your useless faith." Ashley tried to speak again, but before she could say anything, Joseph raised his hand, cutting off any attempt at dialogue. "Enough, Ashley. I'm tired of your prayers and your naive optimism. You're fired," he said, his voice trembling with anger and despair. The entire restaurant fell silent. Everyone present held their breath, shocked by Joseph's sudden explosion. Ashley, for a brief moment, seemed surprised, but she quickly regained her composure. She looked at Joseph, her eyes reflecting a mixture of compassion and sadness. "I understand that you're suffering, Mr. Joseph," she said, her voice calm but firm. "If you think my presence here is a problem, I'll leave. But know that I'll continue to pray for you and for James. I believe that God still has a purpose for all of this, even if we can't understand it now." Without waiting for a response, Ashley walked away, gathering her few belongings. Joseph remained where he was, his heart pounding, still furious, but a part of him was already beginning to regret his words. Deep down, he knew that Ashley didn't deserve to be treated that way, but his pain and anger blinded him. When Ashley reached the door, she stopped and looked back, casting one last glance at Joseph. "I hope that one day you find the peace you so desperately need, Mr. Joseph," she said with a slight smile. "God knows what He's doing." And with those words, she left the restaurant, leaving a heavy silence in the air. The other employees, still in shock, didn't know how to react. Joseph, for his part, felt as if a wave of guilt was beginning to form in his chest. But he quickly pushed it aside, turning his attention back to work, trying to convince himself that he had done the right thing. However, no matter how hard he tried to focus, Ashley's words echoed in his mind. "God knows what He's doing." But how could that be? How could a just and loving God allow so much pain? Joseph took refuge in his anger, ignoring the conflicting emotions that threatened to surface. But no matter how much he tried, he knew that something inside him had changed. Ashley's words, her prayers, the way she left with serenity, all of it made him question, even if he didn't want to admit it. And so the restaurant continued to operate, but with a heavy atmosphere. Joseph, isolated in his despair, tried to maintain control, but doubt was now beginning to take root more deeply in his soul. Ashley, on the other hand, walked down the street feeling a mixture of sadness and hope. She knew she had planted a seed and prayed that one day Joseph would allow it to flourish. She believed that despite everything, God had a plan for that broken man, and that somehow he would find his way back to faith. It was late in the afternoon when Joseph, still shaken by Ashley's dismissal, began to close the restaurant. Business had been slow all day, but that didn't bother him as much as the weight he carried in his chest. Since expelling Ashley, the guilt had been growing inside him like a shadow. His employees worked in silence, avoiding direct contact, aware that Joseph's temper was more volatile than ever. While throwing out the food leftovers, Joseph heard the doorbell ring. Something unusual at that hour when he was about to close. He looked up and saw an elderly man dressed in tattered and dirty clothes, clearly revealing his status as a homeless person. The man entered with hesitant steps, but with a gaze that exuded dignity despite the circumstances. His piercing blue eyes seemed to see beyond appearances. Joseph frowned, preparing to dismiss the stranger as he did with anyone who came asking for something without paying. But before he could open his mouth, the man spoke in a soft but firm voice. "Good evening, sir. Sorry to bother you at this hour. My name is Peter. I haven't eaten anything in 2 days, and I saw that you were closing the restaurant. Could you give me something to eat?" Joseph remained silent for a moment, evaluating the man in front of him. Peter looked tired, but there was something about him that disarmed Joseph. Perhaps it was the respectful manner in which he addressed him, or the serene expression on his face, despite the evident hunger. For the first time in a long time, Joseph felt compassion. Without saying anything, he turned around and began to prepare a plate with the day's leftovers. As he did so, he felt a slight discomfort, a distant memory of when he still believed in acts of kindness before bitterness took over his life. He placed the food on the plate and took it to Peter, who was now sitting at one of the tables. "Here you go," Joseph said, placing the plate in front of the man. "You don't need to pay anything." Peter looked at the food with evident gratitude. His eyes shone as he clasped his hands, closed his eyes, and bowed his head to say a brief prayer of thanks. Joseph, watching the scene, felt something stir inside him, a mixture of curiosity and discomfort. Peter finished his prayer and looked at Joseph with a genuine smile. "Thank you very much, sir. God bless you for this meal." Joseph, accustomed to dismissing any mention of God, this time simply nodded without responding. He sat down at the table across from Peter, as if he felt the need to understand who this man was. "You still believe in God even living like this?" Joseph asked, the incredulity evident in his voice. Peter, without losing his smile, nodded as he began to eat. "Yes, sir. I believe and am grateful to him for each day I'm given. I know life can be tough, but even in the worst moments, God has never abandoned me. He always finds a way to help me, as he did now through you." Joseph couldn't help but sigh in disbelief. How can you be grateful to a God who lets you live on the streets, without food, without a place to sleep? Peter stopped eating for a moment and looked Joseph in the eyes with an expression that mixed patience and wisdom. "Mr. Joseph, life is full of trials, and each of us has our own path to walk. I lost everything I had, but I still have my life and my faith. I know that God is with me, and even though I don't have food every day, there's always someone who extends a hand as you did today. To me, that's proof enough that he hasn't abandoned me." Peter's words hit Joseph like an unexpected blow. He had spent so much time drowning in his bitterness that he couldn't conceive how someone could find gratitude amid so much adversity. And yet there was Peter, a man who, despite everything, still believed there was goodness in the world. "And if he abandoned you completely?" Joseph asked, challenging but without the usual acidity in his voice. Peter smiled again, a calm smile full of conviction. "God never abandons us, Mr. Joseph. Even when we think we're alone, he's there, guiding us, even if we don't understand the reason for our trials. Life may knock us down, but it's our choice to get up and keep going, trusting that there's a greater purpose for everything we face." Joseph remained silent, digesting those words. Something inside him, something he had tried to bury for so long, began to stir. Peter's words, so simple but so full of truth, resonated in his mind. For the first time in many years, he began to question whether there might be something more beyond what he could see and touch. Peter finished his meal and looked at Joseph with gratitude. "Thank you very much, sir. This meal means more to me than you can imagine. May God bless you for your generosity." Joseph nodded slowly, still lost in thought. He watched as Peter stood up and walked toward the door. Before leaving, the old man turned and spoke once more. "Remember, Mr. Joseph, faith can move mountains, but it starts with a small mustard seed. I hope you find what you're looking for." With those words, Peter left the restaurant, leaving Joseph alone with his thoughts. The place seemed strangely empty after Peter's departure, as if the man's presence had filled a space Joseph didn't even know existed. Joseph remained seated at the table for a long time, reflecting on the encounter. Peter's words echoed in his mind, causing him to remember a time when he too believed in something greater, before his faith was destroyed by pain and loss. For the first time in years, Joseph began to reconsider his attitudes, his beliefs, and the life he had been living. He still didn't know what to do with these new feelings, but something had changed. Perhaps, just maybe, there was still a chance to find some kind of redemption, a way to reconcile with life, with others, and maybe, just maybe, with God. But for now, he was only at the beginning of a long inner journey. A journey that had begun that afternoon with a simple plate of food and the words of a man who, despite everything, still believed in miracles. Night was falling over the city when Joseph, still disturbed by the encounter with Peter, made an impulsive decision. Instead of going home, where silence and loneliness awaited him, he headed for a place he hadn't visited in years, the small church at the end of the street. The soft lights of the temple cast a welcoming glow on the sidewalk, but for Joseph, the sight of that church evoked painful memories. It was the same place where he and Claire had been married, where they had prayed for a child, where he had begged for a miracle during his wife's last days. Since then, he had avoided the church like one avoids a wound that doesn't want to be reopened. But something inside him, a restlessness he couldn't name, was pulling him back. Maybe it was Peter's words, or maybe it was the despair he felt about James's situation. All he knew was that he couldn't continue as he was. He needed something, some hope, no matter how small. Joseph pushed open the heavy wooden door of the church and entered, feeling the familiar smell of incense and candle wax. The environment was simple, but filled with a peace Joseph had forgotten existed. The walls were adorned with paintings of saints and biblical passages, and the modestly decorated altar was illuminated by candles that flickered softly. He walked hesitantly to one of the pews and sat down. He was alone in the room, except for one or two people kneeling in prayer. Joseph looked at the altar, where a simple cross hung, and for a moment he felt ridiculous. He, who had mocked God for so long, was now there, seeking something he didn't even know if it still existed. The silence around him seemed oppressive, and Joseph struggled to find the right words. His mind was a jumble of thoughts. But finally, he closed his eyes and let out a deep sigh. "God," he began, his voice low, almost a whisper. I don't know if you're still there, or if you ever were. But if you are, please help my son. Help James come out of this. I can't lose him too. I've already lost Claire and it destroyed me. But I can't lose James. Please." The words came out with difficulty, interrupted by the emotion he was trying to contain. Joseph ran a hand over his face, feeling the tears threatening to fall. He looked at the altar again, now with blurry eyes, and continued, his voice almost breaking. "And if you still care, if there's any justice, take care of her too. Take care of Claire wherever she is. She didn't deserve to suffer like that. I just wish things were different." That last sentence hung in the air, resonating in the silent church. Joseph remained motionless, feeling the weight of his words. For so long, he had avoided acknowledging his pain, his anger, but now, there before God, he allowed himself to feel it all at once. After a long moment, he stood up, feeling strangely light, as if a small part of the burden he carried had been left there, on that church pew. As he turned to leave, he encountered a familiar figure at the door. It was Ashley, watching him with an expression of surprise and tenderness. She had been about to enter for her daily prayers, but hadn't expected to find Joseph there. "Mr. Joseph," she began, not hiding the joy in her voice, "I'm so happy to see you here." Joseph managed a shy smile, still disconcerted by being in that place. "I don't know what I'm doing here, Ashley," he confessed. "I think I'm lost." Ashley approached him without losing her smile and gently placed a hand on his arm. "Sometimes being lost is the first step to finding the right path," she said softly. "Would you like to pray with me? We can pray together for James." Joseph hesitated for a moment, but seeing the sincerity in Ashley's eyes, he nodded. The two knelt together, and Ashley began the prayer, asking for James's recovery and for Joseph's peace of mind. Her calm, faith-filled voice seemed to fill the emptiness Joseph felt, bringing him a comfort he hadn't experienced in a long time. When they finished, Ashley looked at him with a hopeful gleam in her eyes. "God hears all our prayers, Mr. Joseph. Even if we don't see it immediately, He's always working in our favor." Joseph took a deep breath, still feeling the mix of emotions that dominated him. But for the first time, he allowed himself to believe, if only a little, that perhaps Ashley was right. "Thank you, Ashley," he said sincerely. "I don't know if I believe, but I'm trying." Ashley smiled, lightly squeezing his hand. "That's all God asks of us, that we try, even when it's hard." The two left the church together, walking side by side down the quiet street. And although Joseph knew he still had a long way to go, in that moment, he felt something new blooming inside him. A small spark of faith, timid but present. That night, after leaving the church, Joseph and Ashley walked in silence down the street. The weather was calm, but a sense of uncertainty hung in the air. Joseph was absorbed in his thoughts, trying to process everything that had happened that day. As they walked, he turned to Ashley, who looked at him with an expression of understanding and patience. "Ashley," he began hesitantly, "I don't know if I believe in all this yet, but what happened today made me think, and I would like you to come with me tomorrow to the hospital to see James." Ashley smiled, a warm smile full of hope. "Of course, Mr. Joseph. I would be honored to go with you. We can pray together for him." Joseph nodded, feeling a twinge of relief at hearing her answer. Though he was still confused and full of doubts, he felt he could no longer face it all alone. Ashley, with her faith and kindness, was the only person who could bring a little peace to his tormented heart. The next morning, the two went together to the hospital. The atmosphere was heavy with tension, but there was also a new sense of hope. When they arrived, Dr. Caroline greeted them, unsure of what to expect that day. And so, as they entered the ICU where James was, Joseph held Ashley's hand for a brief moment before approaching his son's bed. She began to pray with a soft and faith-filled voice, while Joseph joined her, albeit with timid and hesitant words. Then the miracle happened. During the prayer, James began to show signs of recovery. His fingers moved, and his eyes, which had been closed until then, began to open slowly. Joseph, overcome with indescribable emotion, squeezed James's hand tighter, feeling for the first time in years a real hope blooming in his heart. Dr. Caroline, called in haste, entered the room and was astonished by what was happening. After examining James, she looked at Joseph and Ashley, still unable to believe what she was seeing. This is unbelievable," the doctor murmured, shaking her head in disbelief. "I don't know how to explain it, but this is a true miracle." Joseph, with tears in his eyes, looked at Ashley, who was smiling with emotion. She knew, as he did, that something extraordinary had happened there. And in that moment, Joseph began to believe that the impossible was indeed possible. The miracle he so desperately needed had happened, and Joseph felt his once lost faith begin to be reborn. Although there was still a long road ahead, he knew he was no longer alone to face it. The days following the miracle in the ICU were filled with pure joy and hope for Joseph. With each visit to the hospital, he saw signs of his son's recovery, signs that seemed like a divine gift. James, who had been in a deep coma, now took small steps toward full consciousness. His eyes opened more frequently, and he even managed weak smiles when Joseph spoke to him. James's recovery brought about a significant change in Joseph. The disbelief and skepticism that had dominated his life for so long began to give way to gratitude and a newfound faith. He felt lighter, as if the burden he had carried for so long was finally being lifted. And amidst this transformation, he couldn't help but think of Ashley, the young woman who, with her unwavering faith, had played a crucial role in his journey. One day, shortly after a visit to the hospital, Joseph decided it was time to right a past wrong. He waited for Ashley outside the church, where he knew she would go to pray, and when he saw her, he walked toward her with a shy but sincere smile. "Ashley," he began, a little nervous, I wanted to apologize for what happened before. I was lost, desperate, and I took it all out on you. I shouldn't have fired you like that. You didn't deserve it." Ashley smiled, her eyes reflecting the same kindness as always. "There's no need to apologize, Mr. Joseph. I understand what you were going through, and I kept praying for you and for James. I'm happy to see that he's getting better." Joseph nodded, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders. "I owe you a lot, Ashley. And if you still want, I would love to have you back at the restaurant. It's not just because you're a great employee, but because I think we need people like you around, people who bring light in times of darkness." Ashley's eyes sparkled with emotion, and she accepted the invitation with a radiant smile. "Of course, Mr. Joseph, I would be happy to return." So, Ashley was rehired, and her presence at the restaurant brought a new energy to the place. Joseph, now more open and receptive, began to see life with new eyes. He came to appreciate the small things, the moments with his employees, the conversations with customers, and especially the visits to the hospital to see James. As Joseph grew closer to Ashley, something new began to emerge between her and James. As the young man regained consciousness and strength, Ashley became a constant presence by his side, making daily visits, bringing comfort and hope. Their conversations, initially simple, began to deepen, and James soon found himself drawn to the kindness and faith that Ashley exuded. Ashley, for her part, couldn't deny the affection she felt for James. He was different from Joseph, younger, more cheerful, with a whole life ahead of him. But she also saw in James the same strength and determination she admired in his father, now renewed by the difficult experience they had gone through. The days turned into weeks, and the connection between James and Ashley grew naturally and sweetly. The hospital, once a place of pain and uncertainty, now became a space of new beginnings and blossoming love. Joseph, who observed the growing closeness between the two, felt a quiet joy in his heart. He not only saw his son improving physically, but also witnessed the emergence of something beautiful and pure between James and Ashley. It was as if life was giving them a second chance, not just to survive, but to thrive, love, and find happiness. With each passing day, Joseph felt more connected to this new reality. He prayed daily, thanking God for James's recovery, for Ashley's presence in their lives, and for this new perspective that had been granted to him. The faith that had once been just a distant idea now became part of his routine, guiding his actions and filling his heart with a peace he thought he'd never feel again. And so, Joseph's restaurant, once just a business, began to transform into a place of gatherings and new beginnings, a place where love and faith, reborn from the ashes of pain and loss, flourished once again, bringing new hope to all who gathered there. James was finally discharged from the hospital, news that filled Joseph and Ashley's hearts with joy. After weeks of recovery, he was ready to return home. The miracle of his recovery still hung in the air, and Joseph, now more devout and grateful than ever, saw James's return as living proof of the divine presence in their lives. With James back home, the routine changed, but for the better. Ashley continued to visit him daily, bringing her light and smile to Joseph's home. The visits, initially meant to care for and support James, soon became moments of pure happiness, where the two young people spent hours talking, laughing, and sharing dreams. The connection between James and Ashley strengthened quickly, and it wasn't long before everyone around them noticed that something deeper was blossoming between them. Joseph, observing everything with attentive eyes, felt a quiet joy seeing his son grow closer to Ashley. He knew that their relationship was special, and more than that, was a sign that life was truly offering them a new chance at happiness. One night, while they were having dinner together, Joseph noticed the sparkle in James and Ashley's eyes, and something inside him prompted him to speak. "James, Ashley," Joseph began with a smile on his face. "I've been thinking a lot in recent days, and seeing you two together, I realize how generous life can be even after so much pain. I know it's early, but what if you two considered getting married? In the church, as tradition dictates." James and Ashley exchanged surprised and emotional glances at Joseph's suggestion. The silence that followed was brief but full of meaning. James, holding Ashley's hand, smiled at her and then turned his gaze to his father. "Dad, I think that's the best idea you've ever had," James replied with a sincerity that made Joseph feel a wave of pride and happiness. Ashley, her eyes shining with emotion, nodded and then spoke in a soft voice. "I would love that, Mr. Joseph. Nothing would make me happier than marrying James and building a life alongside him, alongside all of us together." The decision was made right there, in a simple and spontaneous way, but filled with love and meaning. The wedding, which would represent not just the union of James and Ashley, but also the renewal of faith and hope in their lives, would be celebrated in the same church where Joseph had rediscovered his faith. With Joseph's support, the preparations began quickly. The church, which had been the setting for so many prayers, would now be the stage for a new promise, a promise of eternal love and a new life, where faith, gratitude, and love would guide their steps. With James's recovery and the upcoming wedding between him and Ashley, Joseph felt he needed to do something more to express his gratitude for the new life that had been granted to him and his family. The idea of opening a popular restaurant where the needy could eat for free emerged as a way to give back the blessings they had received. The simple and welcoming restaurant was inaugurated within a few months. Joseph named it Mesa de Esperanza, Table of Hope, a place where anyone, regardless of their financial situation, could find a hot meal and an environment of respect and dignity. The community quickly got involved, donating food and volunteering to help with the restaurant's day-to-day operations. For Joseph, each dish served was an expression of his renewed faith and gratitude for all the second chances life had given him. He felt at peace, seeing the smiles on the faces of those who passed through the doors of Mesa de Esperanza. However, something still troubled Joseph. Since the day he decided to open the restaurant, he had been searching for Peter, the homeless old man who had initiated his journey of faith. Joseph roamed the streets, asked about him in shelters and churches, but Peter seemed to have disappeared without a trace. No one knew where he was or if he was even still in the city. This mystery intrigued Joseph. Peter, who had been a beacon in his darkest moment, now seemed to have vanished like a mirage, leaving Joseph with a sense of an unfinished duty. However, at the same time, he felt that Peter had fulfilled his purpose, appearing at the right time to guide him back to the path of faith. Joseph didn't give up his search, but also accepted that perhaps Peter was more than just an ordinary man. Perhaps he was a symbol of divine intervention in his life, a messenger sent to remind him that even in the most difficult situations, there is always a light guiding us back to the right path. And so, as Mesa de Esperanza prospered, Joseph continued his new mission of helping those in need, always with a thought of Peter, the man who, in silence and humility, had changed his life forever. One night, while resting after a long day of work at the popular restaurant, Joseph had a dream that deeply disturbed him. In the dream, he was walking along a deserted and foggy road, feeling lost and lonely. Suddenly, Peter appeared before him, with the same serene expression and eyes full of wisdom that Joseph remembered so well. "Peter!" Joseph called, feeling a mix of relief and urgency. Peter smiled slightly and approached Joseph. When he spoke, his voice was soft but full of meaning. "Joseph, the search for faith is a never-ending journey. You've found it, but you need to keep walking. There are things you still don't understand, but don't be afraid. You've done what was right, and your life is on the right path now." Joseph tried to ask more, but before he could say anything, Peter continued. "Don't look for me anymore. I will always be with you wherever you go, but not as before. My mission here is complete, and now you must follow your path." With those words, Peter slowly moved away, disappearing into the fog that enveloped the road. Joseph tried to run after him, but his feet seemed stuck to the ground. A sense of loss overwhelmed him, but at the same time, there was a strange peace. When Joseph awoke, the dream was still vivid in his mind. He sat up in bed, his heart racing, and felt a mix of sadness and acceptance. Peter, or what he represented, had fulfilled his role in Joseph's life. And now it was time for Joseph to continue his journey, guided by the faith that Peter had helped rekindle. The sense of urgency to find Peter was still present, but Joseph realized that this search no longer needed to be literal. Peter had become a part of his life in a deeper way, as a symbol of the transformation he had experienced. With this understanding, Joseph got up, determined to continue his mission of helping others, knowing that in some way, Peter would always be with him. And so, as the preparations for James and Ashley's wedding continued, Joseph found a new peace in his heart, accepting that some mysteries don't need to be solved, but simply lived. The day of James and Ashley's wedding arrived, bringing with it an atmosphere of joy and anticipation. The small church where Joseph had rediscovered his faith was beautifully decorated, with fresh flowers adorning the altar and pews. Friends and family gathered to celebrate the union of the two young people, who overflowed with happiness as they prepared for the big moment. Joseph, now a transformed man, watched everything with a serene smile. He felt incredibly blessed to be there, witnessing his son's wedding, something he hadn't even dared to imagine months ago. The journey to that point had been marked by pain, doubt, and finally, redemption. Joseph knew there was something greater guiding his life, and his gratitude was immense. When the music began to play and Ashley entered the church, all eyes turned to her. She was stunning in her wedding dress, radiating a peace and joy that seemed to spread to everyone around her. James, waiting for her at the altar, had his eyes fixed on her, the love clear in his expression. As the ceremony progressed, Joseph couldn't hold back the tears of happiness. Seeing his son healthy, in love, and starting a new phase of life alongside Ashley was more than he could have asked for. The faith that had been rekindled in his heart was now strengthened by the sight of his united and happy family. But it was in the middle of the ceremony, as Joseph watched the vows being exchanged, that something inexplicable happened. As he looked at the guests, he saw among the people a figure that made his heart stop for a moment. Peter was there, dressed simply, but with the same expression of serenity and wisdom that Joseph remembered so well. Joseph blinked, confused, trying to understand if he was really seeing what it seemed. He couldn't take his eyes off Peter, and a mix of emotions overwhelmed him: surprise, joy, and a strange sense of peace. However, before he could make any move or say anything, Peter gave a slight nod, as if saying goodbye, and left the church, disappearing among the many guests. Joseph stood up slightly, looking around, but Peter was no longer there. For a moment, he felt lost, but soon a sense of acceptance washed over him. Peter had fulfilled his mission, as he had said in the dream, and now it was time for Joseph to continue the path that had been laid out for him. The ceremony continued to the end, with James and Ashley declaring their love and commitment to each other before God and all present. When they reached the end, the applause echoed through the church, and Joseph felt that his journey had reached a perfect climax. He had not only regained his son, but had also found a new family, a new faith, and a new purpose. On that day, as James and Ashley left the church as husband and wife, Joseph knew that the future was full of possibilities. He was ready to face any challenge that came his way, confident that faith and love would guide him, just as Peter, the mysterious man who had appeared in his life, had guided him to that moment. After James and Ashley's wedding, Joseph couldn't stop thinking about Peter. The brief appearance of Peter during the ceremony left Joseph with an unsettling feeling, a mix of fascination and mystery. Determined to understand who that man really was, who had played such a crucial role in his life, Joseph decided to investigate more deeply. In the following days, he began asking about Peter in various places around the city, in markets, cafes, shelters, and even the church. He described the elderly man with his simple clothes and eyes full of wisdom, hoping that someone had seen or knew something about him. But to his surprise, no one seemed to remember Peter. Those Joseph approached looked at him with curiosity, but none could provide concrete information. Some said they had never seen anyone matching Joseph's description, while others suggested he might be confusing Peter with someone else. Each conversation only deepened the mystery. As the searches proved fruitless, Joseph began to question whether Peter had really existed, or if he was a manifestation of something greater. Perhaps Peter was more than just a man, a kind of messenger, a divine sign sent to guide Joseph back to the path of faith. This idea began to take hold in Joseph's mind. He recalled each encounter with Peter, from the day the old man appeared in his restaurant to the moment he disappeared in the church. Everything seemed so real, but at the same time, so surreal. Peter had entered his life at the most critical moments, offering words of wisdom and comfort, and now he had vanished without a trace. Joseph realized that perhaps the true identity of Peter wasn't something he needed to understand completely. Peter had fulfilled his role, helping Joseph find the faith and peace he had so desperately sought. Now it was time for Joseph to accept that some mysteries in life are better left unsolved. With this revelation, Joseph felt a new tranquility. He had found something far more valuable than concrete answers. He had found faith, purpose, and a new way of seeing the world. Peter, real or not, was a symbol of the transformation Joseph had experienced, and so Joseph decided to stop searching for Peter and continue his life with gratitude, knowing that whatever the truth was, he had been touched by something extraordinary. Time passed quickly after James and Ashley's wedding, and the family's life went on with joy and tranquility. Joseph, now a renewed man, dedicated himself to the popular restaurant and to the constant support of James and Ashley. The love between the two young people flourished with each passing day, and Joseph felt grateful to witness this happiness. One day, Ashley and James arrived at Joseph's house with news that lit up the old man's heart. Ashley, with a radiant smile, announced that she was pregnant. The news was received with great emotion by Joseph, who embraced his son and daughter-in-law, feeling blessed by yet another gift of life. As the months passed, Ashley's pregnancy progressed healthily, and the anticipation for the baby's birth grew. One sunny afternoon, while Joseph was helping James prepare the crib for the soon-to-arrive grandson, Ashley approached with a loving expression. "We have something to tell you, Joseph," she began as she sat next to her father-in-law. "James and I have decided on the baby's name." Joseph looked at her with curiosity and smiled, waiting for the revelation. "We're going to name him Peter," James said, smiling as he saw the surprise in his father's eyes. "We think it's a strong and beautiful name, and it feels right for our son." James's words hit Joseph in an unexpected way. He felt a lump in his throat, and his eyes filled with tears. The choice of name couldn't be a coincidence. Peter, the name of the man who had transformed his life, would now be the name of his grandson, the new life that was about to enter the world. Ashley and James, unaware of the story Joseph carried with him, didn't immediately realize the depth of that moment. But Joseph, overwhelmed by a wave of emotions, understood that this was a clear sign that Peter, in some way, continued to be present in his journey. "Peter," Joseph murmured emotionally as he gently touched Ashley's belly. "It's a perfect name. He will be a blessed boy." The chosen name wasn't just a tribute. For Joseph, it was a confirmation that Peter, whether real or divine, was still by his side, guiding him and protecting his family. As the birth of his grandson approached, Joseph threw himself into the preparations, helping to set up the baby's room and taking care of every detail to ensure that Peter would come into the world surrounded by love and care. Each gesture, each small detail was done with a heart full of faith and gratitude. The morning sun gently illuminated Joseph's house, where he sat in his favorite chair, reflecting on the long journey that had brought him to this point. The silence was filled with a sense of peace he hadn't felt in many years. In his heart, there was only gratitude. Joseph, now a completely transformed man, dedicated his life to helping others through the popular restaurant, which had become a beacon of hope for many. Each act of kindness he performed was a way to repay the blessings he had received. Ashley and James, with their unwavering faith and pure love, had illuminated his life in ways he had never imagined possible. As he eagerly awaited the arrival of his grandson Peter, Joseph felt that life had finally given him what he had so desperately sought: peace and purpose. The pain of the past, which had imprisoned him for so long, had been replaced by renewed faith and a simple but profound joy. Peter, Ashley, James, each of them had been a pillar in his transformation. And now, with the name of Peter etched in his heart, Joseph knew that his journey was complete. He smiled, feeling the gentle breeze that entered through the window, and closed his eyes for a moment in a silent prayer of gratitude. Life, with all its ups and downs, had taught him that faith can arise in the most unexpected moments, and that even the deepest wounds can be healed with love, hope, and the presence of kind souls who cross our paths. And so, with a heart full of gratitude and a serene peace, Joseph awaited the future with confidence, knowing that no matter what came, he was surrounded by the love and faith that had guided him to this point. I hope you enjoyed today's story. If you did, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more stories like this. Leave a like and comment below what you thought about the story. See you